In the remote wilderness of Maine, hidden beneath a veil of devotion, 3 women ran what appeared to be a religious sanctuary for over 30 years. More than 600 women entered its gates, seeking spiritual healing. Fewer than half ever returned, and those who did were no longer the same. The Maine State Archives hold testimony from one survivor so disturbing, so nightmarish, that authorities sealed it from public access for over a century. Tonight, that silence ends. This is the true story of what happened inside the stone walls of the Convent of Eternal Tears. But before we descend into the darkness, a warning. This channel isn't for the faint of heart. It's for those who dare to peer behind history's velvet curtain and see what horrors truly lie beneath. If you're one of the brave, hit that subscribe button and tell us, what state are you listening from? Are you bold enough to walk with us through this chapter of forgotten American terror? Let's find out together. What makes this story so chilling isn't ghosts, curses, or divine punishment. It wasn't religious madness or spiritual warfare. It was something colder, smarter, more human. The calculated pursuit of knowledge, no matter the cost. All hidden behind a mask of charity, faith, and Christian mercy. It began in the late 1700s, when the District of Maine was still under the jurisdiction of Massachusetts, a land of brutal winters, isolated settlements, and superstitious townsfolk clinging to survival. Mill Bridge, a struggling coastal town of barely 300 souls, served as a modest trading outpost for lumbermen and fishermen brave enough to sail the icy Atlantic. 15 miles inland, swallowed by forests and marked only by fading Wabanaki hunting trails, lay a piece of land untouched by man until 1798. That October, under a slate-gray sky, a horse-drawn wagon creaked into Millbridge. Its passengers, 3 women who would become infamous in whispered legends and forbidden texts. Their names: Agatha, Prudence, and Temperance Ashford. The townsfolk watched as crates, marked fragile medical, were unloaded with unnatural care. But it was the women themselves who drew the most attention. Mother Superior Agatha Ashford, the eldest, stepped down first. In her early 40s, with silver-streaked auburn hair coiled tightly beneath a black wimple, she had the bearing of European nobility. Her gray eyes were unblinking and precise, studying every soul, every corner, as if categorizing a living anatomy chart. Her accent, upper-class English. Her demeanor, unshakably calm. She was a woman accustomed to obedience. Sister Prudence Ashford, tall and gaunt, followed. Only 30 years old, she moved like a surgeon. Fingers long, pale, steady. Her skin was porcelain, almost bloodless. Her words, rare. And when she did speak, always measured, with a faint Scottish undertone, it made even hardened loggers shift uncomfortably. Novice Temperance Ashford came last. Barely 22. Raven-black hair fell in waves over a face that belonged more in oil paintings than the New World wilderness. Eyes as dark as ink. Skin too smooth, too perfect. She was beautiful in a way that felt wrong. Mothers instinctively pulled their children closer when she passed. And when she smiled, it never quite reached her eyes. The Ashford women claimed to be Anglican nuns, refugees from English religious persecution, here to build a new spiritual order. They carried glowing letters from church authorities in London. Years later, those letters would be exposed as masterful forgeries. But in 1798, they were enough. Millbridge, a deeply Protestant town, saw them as a gift. Educated religious women, well-spoken, wealthy, were rare in the frontier, and they brought gold. A lot of it. They purchased 200 acres of unclaimed woodland from a grieving widow, paying triple the land's value. The townspeople asked no further questions. Construction began immediately. The sisters hired every carpenter, mason, and able-bodied laborer in the region. What they built was unlike any convent the workers had ever seen. A towering 3-story structure of gray coastal stone, its walls thick and soundless. Windows were small, set high, offering no view in or out. And the basement. Its excavation was unusually deep. Foundations were reinforced. Drainage systems were industrial in scale. Ventilation shafts ran unnaturally wide through the stone, more fitting for a hospital than a house of prayer. When questioned, Mother Agatha offered a serene explanation. "Penitence," she said, "requires solitude. Solitude requires proper containment." She smiled. "Our sisters in England have learned that healing only comes when the spirit is isolated from the distractions of the world." Most workers accepted her answer. But the older men, the ones who'd buried more than their share of secrets in the woods, whispered among themselves. This was not a convent. It was a fortress. The Ashford women supervised every detail with unnerving precision. They ordered custom iron doors with internal locking systems. Certain rooms were lined with copper sheeting, something none of the workers had ever seen. And then came the medical requests: steel restraints, hinged beds, drainage canals under stone slabs. It was not prayer they were preparing for. It was experimentation. Enter Dr. Samuel Hartwell, a traveling physician known for progressive thinking and an obsession with the female mind. He met the sisters in early 1799. What he found astonished him. They spoke of hysteria, melancholia, night terrors, all with stunning clarity. They described methods for curing root causes of mental illness, not merely treating symptoms. In his journal, Hartwell wrote, "The sisters possess knowledge of the female condition that is decades beyond even European medicine. Their methods, while unorthodox, are grounded in principles we have barely begun to explore." But there was a second journal, a private one. In it, he recorded a conversation with Mother Agatha, an agreement. In return for referring challenging female patients to the convent and supplying medical tools through his contacts, he would receive a generous monthly payment and access to the sisters' meticulous case studies, written in Latin, coded with symbols, diagrams, and autopsy notes. What happened next is buried beneath a century of silence. But we have the records. And next time, we'll open them. Because what lay beyond the convent's stone walls was not spiritual. It was scientific. It was surgical. And it was utterly without mercy. For a frontier physician barely scraping by, the offer was too good to refuse. Steady income, medical prestige, and the chance to collaborate with women who, by all appearances, were decades ahead of the American medical establishment. And so, the arrangement was made. Quietly, efficiently. The Convent of Eternal Tears would be his unofficial clinic, and he, its silent partner. Word of the convent's miraculous success spread quickly, like a rumor too shameful to be printed, but too irresistible to ignore. Families across the region, from the fishing shacks of Portsmouth to the drawing rooms of Boston, began hearing about the Ashford sisters. They spoke in hushed tones of a place where disobedient daughters were transformed into model citizens, where rebellious wives returned docile, spiritual, and silent. The cost was steep: $20 silver for 1 month, 50 for 3, 100 for what they called complete reformation. But for families drowning in scandal or shame, it was a small price to restore order and respectability. The women sent to the convent reflected a deep, collective fear. Unmarried mothers who refused to name their lovers. Wives who dared question their husbands in public. Daughters who resisted arranged marriages. Girls who read too many books or spoke too freely about politics. Any woman who defied the rigid cage of 19th century femininity could find herself delivered to the convent in the dead of night, with prayers, signatures, and tears. Religious tensions added another layer. Puritan families sent daughters drawn to Anglican ceremony. Anglicans disposed of girls seduced by Baptist revivalism. The Ashford sisters welcomed all faiths with equal fervor, claiming their methods transcended denominations. Their tool of salvation? Not scripture, not prayer, discipline. The first true crack in the convent's mask came in the bitter chill of February, 1803. 20-year-old trapper Thomas Brewster was deep in the woods, tracking a wounded deer through a thick snowstorm. He knew these woods like his own blood, knew the natural sounds of the night: wolves howling, ice cracking, wind whispering. But what he heard that night was wrong. Through the snow-choked air came the sound of screaming, raw, human, and unbearable. It wasn't just pain. It was torment. The screams rose and fell like waves, sometimes whimpering, then suddenly exploding into shrieks so violent, Thomas froze where he stood. He crept toward the sound, drawn despite himself. The convent loomed black against the pale snow. No lights in the upper windows. No motion. But as Thomas circled toward the rear, he saw it. A faint orange glow leaking from a snow-drifted basement window. And the screams grew louder. Closer now, other sounds reached him. The metallic clink of tools. Urgent voices murmuring. And something mechanical, like a saw. Thomas knelt at the frost-covered window, and what he saw would burn itself into his memory forever. The basement had been transformed into a surgical chamber. Stone walls flickered with the light of dozens of oil lamps. A woman lay strapped to a wooden table, arms bound, legs secured, head held fast by a gleaming iron brace. Part of her hair had been shaved. Dark ink lines marked her scalp. Her skull had been opened. Bone gleamed wetly under the lamplight, and beneath it, Thomas saw something slick, pinkish, and horrifyingly alive. Her brain. Sister Prudence stood over her, face flushed, eyes cold with concentration. She held a long, thin metal rod, probing, twisting, pressing into exposed tissue. The woman screamed again, but it was dying now. More terror than voice. Mother Agatha stood nearby, taking notes with calm detachment, like a scientist observing a lab experiment. Novice Temperance moved silently, passing tools, adjusting straps, wiping blood with mechanical grace. When Prudence pressed the rod deeper, the woman's scream crescendoed, then stopped. Her body slackened, unconscious, or worse. But the sisters kept working, with precision, without emotion. This wasn't exorcism. It wasn't healing. It was surgery. Cold, deliberate, rehearsed. Thomas ran. He fled through the snow, breath ragged, heart thundering, stumbling blindly back to town. He burst into his father's blacksmith shop at dawn, shaking, raving, incoherent with horror. He spoke of scalpels, of brain matter, of women screaming in stone dungeons. His father, a stern and practical man, tried to calm him. You were out in a storm, alone, exhausted. The mind can play cruel tricks, son. But Thomas's descriptions were too detailed, too exact. He described the layout of the room, the configuration of instruments, even the sisters' roles, observing, assisting, recording. This was no hallucination. This was systematic. Disturbed, the elder Brewster brought the story to Deacon Morrison, the town's most respected leader, a cautious man known for moral clarity and quiet diplomacy. The convent, after all, had been in Millbridge for 5 years. The sisters were generous, polite, distant but respected. More importantly, several prominent families had wives and daughters inside right now. We must tread carefully, Morrison warned. One wild accusation could tear this town apart. Still, he agreed to investigate. Quietly, under the pretense of arranging a church fundraiser. Mother Agatha welcomed him into the convent's austere parlor. A cold room of dark paintings and a towering crucifix that seemed to scowl. She served tea, spoke of scripture, asked about his family with gentle interest. When Morrison mentioned that hunters had reported odd noises, her expression turned grave, but serene. Deacon, she said, we often conduct spiritual cleansings during the night. Some women arrive deeply possessed by demons of pride, rebellion, lust. When those demons are cast out, they scream, as you might imagine. She smiled, softly. Purification is rarely quiet. The deacon nodded. The explanation, while unsettling, wasn't alien. The idea of spiritual warfare was woven into frontier Christianity. Agatha then offered him a tour. The upper floors only. He was led through clean, barren dormitories where women sat in silence, hands folded, faces downcast. But something was wrong. They moved strangely, too slowly, too precisely. Their expressions were blank. Their eyes didn't seem to see him. They stared through him, as if looking toward something far away, or nothing at all. When he asked to see the lower levels, Agatha declined gently. "Our most sensitive work occurs there," she said. "It would be inappropriate, especially for a man. Some spiritual treatments involve intimate exposure of the soul." It was an answer that, by the standards of the time, was entirely acceptable. And so Deacon Morrison left, officially reassured. But on the ride home, unease gnawed at him. A quiet dread. The residents had moved like automatons, and there had been a scent in the air, not of prayer or cleanliness, but of iron, blood, and something decaying. It reminded him of the battlefield hospitals he'd visited during the war, where pain clung to the walls like smoke, and suffering left its own kind of rot. Following the deacon's visit, the convent changed. Security increased. Deliveries were taken in at night. And the screaming stopped. But the silence that followed was somehow worse. Colder. Thicker. The kind of silence that means something terrible is being hidden very, very well. Despite the earlier nocturnal disturbances and chilling rumors, families continued sending their troubled daughters and wives to the convent of eternal tears. The Ashford sisters, composed and pious as ever, welcomed each arrival with open arms and increasingly sophisticated promises of spiritual transformation. But over time, attentive townsfolk began to notice something deeply wrong. Women who left the convent weren't simply reformed. They were, inexplicably and disturbingly, changed. Mary Prescott had once been a firebrand. 19 years old, full of sharp wit and unapologetic opinions, she had scandalized Millbridge by turning down 3 marriage proposals. Her parents, mortified by her brazenness, committed her to 6 months of preparation for married life. She returned silent, blank-eyed, obedient. She accepted the very next proposal with dull compliance, showing no preference or affection. Her laughter, her curiosity, her spark, gone. Even her mother, at first relieved, began to worry. Mary failed to recognize childhood friends or recall her favorite meals. When handed letters she'd once written, she regarded them like foreign documents. More terrifying still, she seemed immune to emotion. Dr. Hartwell, now a full supporter of the sisters, praised their work as a breakthrough. The rebellious spirit has been eliminated. The patient is suitable for marriage and motherhood, he declared. But Mary bore scars on her scalp, deliberate patterns half hidden beneath her hair. When asked, she simply said she didn't remember. Only that she had prayed hard to become a better woman. More stories emerged. Hannah Morse, grieving her infant's death, was sent to the convent for melancholia. She returned unnaturally cheerful. When shown her baby's belongings, she insisted she'd never had a child. Elizabeth Thornton, a merchant's wife, had demanded a divorce after discovering her husband's infidelity. After 4 months in the convent, she reappeared smiling, insisting her marriage had always been perfect. She denied ever having made accusations. Her family noticed her confusion, the way she forgot names and got lost in familiar places. She too bore scars. Dr. Hartwell's glowing praise grew increasingly manic. He drank, rambled. His journals, found after his death, painted a grim picture. The procedures violate every principle of medical ethics. And yet, the results are irrefutable. The Ashford sisters achieve what Europe only dreams of, the power to erase, reshape, silence the mind. Letters poured into the convent. Packages arrived from Vienna, Edinburgh, Paris, medical texts, chemicals, surgical tools. Mother Superior Agatha traveled monthly to Portland and Boston, returning with crates labeled fragile. She told curious townspeople they were pioneering new treatments for feminine maladies. Behind the pious smile, something monstrous was growing. Some began to ask questions. Martha Goodwin, whose daughter Rebecca had been treated, quietly interviewed other families. She discovered a chilling pattern. Not one woman remembered her time in the convent, and some never returned at all. When families asked about missing daughters, the Ashford sisters claimed they had taken vows of silence and seclusion. Contact was prohibited. Wealthy families from as far as Charleston began sending their daughters, paying hundreds, even thousands, for a promise of complete reformation. By 1815, the convent had treated over 400 women. Their records showed a 90% Success rate. Those who died during treatment were quietly recorded as failures. The sisters evolved. Their methods refined. Sister Prudence became a master of what she called targeted cranial intervention. Her anatomical sketches, found decades later, showed precise diagrams for reaching specific brain regions. Surgical technique, refined by practice. Novice Temperance perfected psychological conditioning. Deprivation, isolation, humiliation, reward cycles. Women were systematically dismantled and rebuilt. Through foreign contacts, the sisters obtained experimental drugs that altered memory, behavior, and emotion. Their operation expanded. They began accepting volunteers, destitute women who exchanged their bodies for food and shelter. The records revealed a black market in human research. Ashford documentation was sold to major European institutions. Dr. Zimmermann of the University of Vienna paid thousands for data on memory suppression and emotional blunting. The University of Edinburgh, ironically, the same institution that had expelled Agatha decades earlier, unknowingly bought her findings through intermediaries. Soon, the Ashford sisters began taking custom orders. Suppress romantic urges. Eliminate intellectual curiosity. Increase domestic compliance. The price? Whatever the market would bear. The illusion of holiness unraveled in 1818. Sarah Whitman, 24, was committed by her Boston family for the crime of bearing a child out of wedlock. But Sarah was no ordinary patient. Educated, defiant, brilliant. Her father, ironically, had introduced her to medical texts. From her first day, she knew something was wrong. She saw the vacant eyes, the scars, the tremors and memory loss. She recognized neurological damage. Subjected to psychological abuse, starvation, and isolation, Sarah endured. She used the time to map the convent, observe routines, and hide notes in the seams of her clothing. During a storm in March 1819, flooding in the basement forced the sisters to move their experiments to upper levels. In the chaos, Sarah slipped away. What she found in the flooded basement would shatter any remaining illusions. Operating tables with leather restraints. Surgical tools soaked in blood. Glass jars of preserved brain tissue, labeled with names and dates. Anatomical sketches showing precise brain damage techniques. Letters confirming sales of research to foreign buyers. Sarah knew she had days before being subjected to the same fate. On a moonless night in April 1819, she escaped. 3 days of relentless pursuit. Rain, hunger, exposure. She was hunted like an animal. But then she found Joshua Meadows, a local trapper. After hearing her story and seeing the evidence she carried, he sheltered her, fed her, and led her to safety. On April 18th, she stumbled into the sheriff's office in Millbridge. At first, she was dismissed. But then she showed them the documents. A surgical log of 23 women, detailing procedures to eliminate memory, emotion, or curiosity. Correspondence with Dr. Zimmermann, buying data on how to reshape the female mind. A catalog of over 600 women processed since 1798, many never returned. And finally, the case of Margaret Fowler, a 19-year-old punished for excessive reading. Her brain was surgically altered to remove intellectual capacity. Post-op notes concluded, *, patient displays appropriate feminine docility and no longer engages in abstract thought. Sarah Whitman's testimony sparked a reckoning. But the story was far from over. Whose current whereabouts were unspecified. Most troubling of all, nearly 200 entries were marked simply as expired. Women who had died during or shortly after experimental procedures. Sheriff Hawthorne, confronted with this overwhelming evidence, realized he was dealing with crimes that exceeded anything in his experience. He immediately organized a raid on the convent, assembling a force of 15 armed men for what he now understood would be far more than a routine arrest. The sheriff also sent urgent messages to authorities in Portland and Boston, requesting assistance from federal marshals who would have jurisdiction over crimes of this magnitude. However, the Ashford sisters had been monitoring the situation through their network of informants in Millbridge. By the time the raiding party reached the convent on the morning of May 20, 1819, they found the building completely abandoned. The sisters had vanished during the night, taking with them most of their portable equipment and documentation, leaving behind only the evidence they couldn't transport. The search of the abandoned convent revealed a chamber of horrors that traumatized even the most hardened members of the raiding party. The basement contained a fully equipped surgical theater with implements specifically designed for cranial procedures. The walls were lined with shelves holding hundreds of preserved brain specimens, each labeled with detailed information about the patient from whom it had been removed and the specific experiments that had been conducted. A hidden chamber behind a false wall contained 47 bodies in various states of preservation, all showing evidence of cranial surgery. The bodies had been maintained in a solution of alcohol and other chemicals, apparently for ongoing study purposes. Each corpse was tagged with detailed information about the procedures that had been performed and the results that had been achieved before death. The investigators also discovered extensive documentation left behind in the sisters' hasty departure. File cabinets contained thousands of pages of surgical notes, patient records, and correspondence with medical institutions throughout the world. The scope of the operation was staggering. The sisters had been conducting systematic human experimentation for over 20 years, documenting procedures that wouldn't be recognized by mainstream medicine for decades. Dr. Samuel Hartwell, when confronted with evidence of his complicity in the operation, initially attempted to justify his involvement by claiming he was advancing medical science for the benefit of humanity. These women were already lost to society, he argued desperately. Their conditions made them unsuitable for normal life. At least their suffering contributed to knowledge that will help future generations. However, when presented with the full scope of the experimentation and the evidence of systematic murder disguised as medical treatment, Dr. Hartwell suffered what appeared to be a complete mental breakdown. In his final confession, delivered while under guard in the Millbridge jail, he revealed the true identities of the Ashford sisters and the full extent of their criminal background. The women known as Mother Superior Agatha, Sister Prudence, and Novice Temperance Ashford were actually Dr. Agatha Brennan, Dr. Prudence Ashford, and Dr. Temperance Ashford, trained physicians who had been expelled from European medical institutions for conducting unauthorized human experiments. Dr. Brennan had been banned from practicing medicine in Scotland after several patients died during her experimental procedures designed to correct feminine hysteria through surgical intervention. Dr. Prudence Ashford had been dismissed from the University of Edinburgh Medical School after being caught conducting illegal experiments on asylum patients, attempting to map brain function through systematic damage to different cranial regions. Dr. Temperance Ashford, the youngest of the three, had been her sister's student in developing psychological conditioning techniques designed to enhance the effects of surgical procedures. The three women had fled Europe in 1797 and established their false identity as Anglican nuns to provide cover for continuing their research in a location where they would be free from medical oversight or legal constraints. They had spent over 20 years perfecting techniques for modifying human behavior through surgical intervention, accumulating knowledge that legitimate researchers could only dream of obtaining. The manhunt for the escaped Ashford sisters became one of the most extensive criminal investigations in early American history, involving federal marshals, local sheriffs, and even international cooperation with European authorities. However, the three women had vanished completely, leaving behind only the horrific evidence of their 2 decades of systematic human experimentation. Investigation revealed that the sisters had maintained multiple escape routes from the convent and had accumulated substantial wealth from their illegal activities. Bank records discovered during the investigation showed they had transferred enormous sums to accounts in Canada, Mexico, and several European countries over the years. The total amount exceeded $50,000, a fortune that would be worth millions in today's currency. The sisters had also established false identities and safe houses throughout North America and Europe, suggesting they had planned their eventual escape from the beginning of their American operations. Shipping records indicated they had been gradually moving equipment and documentation out of the convent for months before Sarah's escape, preparing for the possibility that their activities would eventually be discovered. The investigation revealed the full scope of their criminal enterprise. Over the course of 21 years, the Ashford sisters had processed more than 600 women through their experimental programs. Of these, approximately 250 had been returned to their families as successfully treated patients, though investigation revealed that all showed signs of brain damage consistent with surgical intervention. Another 50 women had been reported as choosing to remain at the convent as permanent residents, though no trace of these women was ever found. The sisters had apparently murdered these patients when their conditions made them unsuitable for return to society, preserving their bodies for ongoing study and disposing of the remains when preservation was no longer useful. The remaining 200 women were found in various states of preservation throughout the convent's hidden chambers. These appeared to be patients who had died during experimental procedures or had been deliberately killed when their responses to treatment provided valuable research data. The systematic preservation of these bodies suggested they had been maintained for comparative study over extended periods. The investigation also uncovered evidence of an extensive network of collaborators throughout the medical and academic communities. Dr. Hartwell was only one of several physicians who had referred patients to the convent and provided medical supplies in exchange for access to experimental results. Postal workers, suppliers, and even some local officials had been paid to maintain secrecy about the convent's activities. Universities throughout America and Europe were found to have unknowingly incorporated the Ashford sisters' research into their medical curricula. Surgical techniques and psychological theories that were being taught to new generations of physicians were based on systematic human experimentation conducted in the Maine wilderness. The discovery forced a painful re-examination of the sources of medical knowledge and the ethical standards of the profession. The families of victims faced an agonizing choice between seeking justice and protecting their reputations. Public acknowledgement that their daughters and wives had been subjected to horrific experimentation would expose them to social scandal and destroy their standing in their communities. Most chose silence, preferring to live with private grief rather than public shame. This conspiracy of silence meant that the full extent of the Ashford sisters' crimes was never officially acknowledged. The investigation was quietly closed after 6 months, with most of the evidence sealed in government archives that wouldn't be opened for over a century. The official record simply stated that 3 women operating a fraudulent medical facility had fled justice, leaving behind evidence of irregular treatment methods. The convent building was eventually burned to the ground by local residents who wanted to erase all trace of what had occurred there. However, the extensive documentation of the sisters' experiments was preserved and eventually made its way to medical institutions throughout the world. Ironically, research that had been obtained through such horrific means contributed to legitimate advances in understanding brain function and psychological disorders. Sarah Whitman, the sole survivor to escape and expose the truth, struggled for years with the trauma of her experience. She spent months providing testimony to investigators and helping to identify other victims, but the emotional toll was devastating. The knowledge that she was the only person willing to speak publicly about the horrors she had witnessed isolated her from a society that preferred to forget such uncomfortable truths. Sarah eventually moved to California under an assumed name, where she worked as a teacher while trying to rebuild her life. She never married and maintained minimal contact with her family, who were embarrassed by her public testimony about the convent. Her detailed memoir, written shortly before her death in 1863, provided the most complete account of life inside the Convent of Eternal Tears and served as crucial historical evidence of the sisters' crimes. The Ashford sisters themselves were never captured, though unconfirmed reports placed them in various locations throughout the Americas and Europe over the following decades. Some investigators believe they continued their work under different identities, while others suggested they had been killed by associates seeking to eliminate witnesses to their crimes. A reported sighting in Argentina in 1847 described 3 elderly women operating a private medical facility for wealthy families, but investigation proved inconclusive. The most credible account came from a French physician who claimed to have encountered Dr. Agatha Brennan in Paris. In 1856, a report surfaced from a respected French physician who claimed to have encountered a woman in Paris practicing under the name Dr. Genevieve Delacroix. She specialized in the treatment of female nervous disorders, employing methods uncannily similar to those once recorded in the dark ledgers of the Maine convent. The use of cranial pressure points, restricted sensory environments, and chemical sedation was strikingly familiar. But before authorities could act on the physician's suspicions, the woman vanished, leaving behind a carefully scrubbed clinic and no trace of her identity. The only evidence of her presence was a handwritten casebook, half burned in the fireplace, bearing diagrams too reminiscent of Sister Prudence's anatomical sketches to be coincidence. This was the final, unconfirmed glimpse of the Ashford sisters. The case of the Convent of Eternal Tears remains, to this day, one of the most prolonged and systematically hidden atrocities in early American history. For over 2 decades, 3 women, trained physicians cast out by the European medical elite, operated a clandestine facility under the veil of religious piety and psychological reform. They combined scientific rigor with profound moral depravity, documenting every incision, every behavioral shift, every extinguished identity. Their techniques, some disturbingly precise, others monstrously crude, would predate and even predict many aspects of psychosurgery, behavioral modification, and neurology that modern science would not formally explore until the 20th century. But every revelation came at a price. Hundreds of women, many sent away by families desperate to erase shameful behavior or restore social order, were subjected to unspeakable violations of the mind and body. Some returned home hollowed out, their spirits shattered and rewritten. Others were never seen again, preserved in jars, buried in hidden chambers, or quietly marked as expired in the sisters' cold, clinical ledgers. Yet perhaps the darkest revelation was not the crimes themselves, but the silence that followed. Communities looked away. Families, fearing scandal, chose secrecy over justice. Medical institutions, quietly benefiting from the stolen research, folded the knowledge into their growing libraries without asking too many questions. Even the government, once aware, sealed the case behind locked archives, deeming the public too fragile, or perhaps too complicit, to face the full weight of what had occurred. This chapter reveals not only what was done, but what was allowed. It exposes how vulnerable women in early American society could be, reduced to medical curiosities or moral failures, handed over for correction, and subjected to horrors beneath a shroud of scientific progress. It reveals how social respectability, religious authority, and intellectual ambition can form a triumvirate of quiet brutality, each reinforcing the other, each masking the truth. And it asks us to consider a question more uncomfortable than any detail of brain surgery or psychological torment. What if it could happen again? What if it is happening again? Under new names, in new buildings, with new technologies that promise transformation, correction, or salvation. Do you believe such systematic horror could truly remain hidden, buried behind reputations, research grants, and respectable titles? Let us know in the comments. Is the pursuit of knowledge still outpacing our morality? If this tale chilled you to the bone, share it with someone who dares to face the shadows of history. Hit that subscribe button and turn on the bell icon so you won't miss the next buried secret we unearth together. Because the past is never truly gone. It waits in silence, behind stone walls, beneath forgotten floorboards, inside sealed government archives. For someone brave enough to look.